Welcome everyone. This is the beginning of the gastrointestinal physiology section of this course. This is really the beginning of our, our in-depth study of human physiology. The previous sections were really helping us to gear up for this section. Today we'll talk a little bit about the overview of the gastrointestinal system, talk about some of the functions, and we'll talk about some of the challenges that it faces. And in order to really understand the physiology to a functional degree, we have to understand the structures of the gastrointestinal system. So we'll go through some specific anatomy, and we're going to go through a little bit of the layers of the gastrointestinal system, specifically in the stomach and the small intestine. So when we talk about the gastrointestinal system, sometimes referred to as the digestive system, sometimes referred to as the gastrointestinal tract, referred to as the GI tract for short, and sometimes also referred to as the alimentary tract. All of these mean the same thing, but essentially what the GI system is a tube passing through the body. It's sort of like a tube opening at either end, and while things pass through, they either get broken down and absorbed or things get secreted into this tube. But one of the things to really recognize here is that since it's a tube, everything that exists within the alimentary tract or the gastrointestinal tract is considered on the outside of the body. Even though we think of these things as being inside, they're open. It's an open system. So it's part of the external environment. Each end of the digestive system is closed off by a skeletal muscle sphincter so that we can control when either end is open. So really try to keep that in mind, that this is part of the external environment. And because it's part of the external environment, there are many challenges that the digestive system faces. And some of these challenges include, well, our GI tract is really important in digestion. And we are made of the same biomolecules that the things we ingest are. So one of the challenges is we can't digest our own cells. The powerful enzymes that we use are to break down food, but they can also cause damage of our own cells, especially the enzymes that break down fats or lipids, the enzymes that break down proteins, carbohydrates. Those can break down those same proteins, fats, and carbohydrates in our own cells in a process known as autodigestion. We don't want that happening. So we have to have some way of protecting ourselves against autodigestion. Another challenge of the GI tract is trying not to get dehydrated. We have to match our fluid intake with how much fluid is being secreted into the GI tract. The total amount of secretion in our GI tract is 7 liters per day. Now, that's a lot of fluid, and if we don't have an ability to reabsorb that fluid, we can very quickly get dehydrated. So we have to make sure that the fluid that we intake from our food and drink is really matched by the amount that is reabsorbed. And so we'll look at ways that our GI tract does that. The major way is that the absorption process within the GI tract is very efficient. In fact, we only lose about 100 mils of fluid from that 7 liters. And there are some conditions that can lead to very quick dehydration. So if you're unable to keep things down or keep that external fluid that you take in, if we're unable to keep that because of, say, vomiting, we can very quickly get dehydrated. Or if we're unable to reabsorb all that fluid that has been secreted, or absorb the fluid that has been ingested from a diarrheal process, we can get very quickly dehydrated from that as well. So we have to have a way to make sure that we don't get dehydrated. Because we're open to the external environment, we're intaking things for a nutritional purpose, but we also have to make sure that we prevent foreign invaders from entering. So bacteria, fungus, viruses, well, some of them will be killed off in the stomach by the very low pH. Not all of them will. And so the other problem is that if we unfold every aspect of the GI tract, the entire surface area is about the size of a tennis court. So that's a huge surface area for these foreign invaders to get in. And so while we have this huge surface area to bring in nutrients and water and electrolytes, keeping out the bacteria and the fungus and the viruses or those bugs is really hard. So we have to have some sort of defense mechanisms to make sure that we don't have bad things come into our body. And so one of the defense mechanisms, so a lot of our organs within our GI tract are lined with mucus. Not all of them are, but some of them. So mucus makes it really difficult for bacteria and viruses and fungi to get into the actual cells. It's not impossible, but it makes it difficult. We have digestive enzymes that can help digest some of those foreign invaders and to neutralize them. We also have a huge amount of this stuff called gut-associated lymphoid tissue. And so lymphoid tissue is part of our immune system. So if you've heard of lymph nodes, that's lymphoid tissue. If you've ever heard of your lymphocytes, lymphocytes are cells of our immune system that sort of stem from some of the lymphoid tissue, specifically the thymus, and they sort of reside in our lymph nodes. The largest collection of lymphoid tissue in our body is actually in our gastrointestinal tract. It accounts for close to 80% of our of the entire body's lymphocytes. So we have a huge ability for our immune cells to recognize and to defend against these foreign invaders. So between mucus, digestive enzymes, even the low pH of the stomach, and this gut-associated lymphoid tissue, we have a lot of mechanisms in place to keep as many of these foreign invaders out of our bloodstream in our body. So we somehow have to absorb nutrients, yet not absorb the invaders. We have to secrete digestive enzymes to break down our food, but we have to make sure that we don't get digested. And we need to secrete fluids, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we don't get dehydrated because of the amount of fluid that we're secreting. So these are the main challenges of the GI tract. The way that we overcome them is that we coordinate 4 processes. And the 4 processes that we coordinate are digestion. There's the process of digestion, which is breaking down food into smaller units that we can actually absorb. The second part is actually absorbing those nutrients. We coordinate digestion, absorption. We coordinate what we secrete into our GI system, the tube of the GI tract or the lumen. And we coordinate the movement of these substances throughout our GI tract. By coordinating these 4 processes, we can meet some of those challenges. So, for example, the idea of secreting all that fluid that will have digestive enzyme, we have that ability to secrete all that fluid, but we also have the ability to absorb it all, or most of it. We have an ability to digest the food because of secretion of digestive enzymes, and some of that digestion from the digestive enzymes will help neutralize some of those foreign invaders. So it's really about coordinating these 4 basic processes. And that's really going to be our our main goal when we talk about GI physiology. We're going to talk about the idea of digestion and absorption. We're going to talk about motility, and we're going to talk about secretion. Before we can understand the actual physiology, really important to have a good understanding of the basic anatomy within the digestive tract. If you've taken anatomy, you will know this in much more detail than what I'm going to talk about. My goal here is to make sure that I'm discussing this with you from the standpoint of what do you need to know in order to understand the physiology. So the GI tract starts in the oral cavity. It's really a receptacle for food. It's a place for physical digestion with teeth. So we have teeth that can break down our food. There's also, within our oral cavity, the lubrication of food and moistening of food through saliva. And that saliva is produced by several glands that are located within our oral cavity. And so those major types of salivary glands, the largest one is actually right by our ear, and it's called the parotid gland. It's the largest of the salivary glands. We have a submandibular gland, which, as its name implies, it's under the lower jawbone or the mandible. And then the last of the major salivary glands is the one that's under the tongue. Lingula means tongue, so it's under the tongue, under the lingula, sublingular. You have hundreds of minor salivary glands, tiny little ones everywhere, but these are the three major ones that you should know contribute to the production of saliva. And saliva is this hypoosmotic fluid. Hypoosmotic meaning that it is the amount of dissolved substances like ions within it is less than what you would find in the blood. That's what it means by hypo, less than the amount of dissolved solute in the blood. Consists mainly of water, but there's also an element of mucus that helps lubricate the food. So you moisten and you lubricate the food. There are some ions within saliva, not as many as you'd find in the blood. And there's actually also a couple of other things. You may have already known that there are some digestive enzymes. Specifically, there's an enzyme that can help break down some carbohydrates. And we'll talk about that enzyme a little bit later. It's called amylase, but we'll talk in depth about that. And there's also an immune function with saliva. There are some immune proteins that are secreted in the saliva that help maintain oral health. We produce about 1 liter of saliva every single day. So there's 1 liter of that 7 liters that's produced. So that if you don't actually absorb that 1 liter, there would be a liter of fluid that you're losing. Going further than the oral cavity, the next part of the GI tract is the esophagus. The esophagus actually begins as skeletal muscle. And so skeletal muscle, all that really means is that it's under voluntary control. And about 2/3 of the way down, this skeletal muscle transitions to smooth muscle. Smooth muscle meaning that it's not under voluntary control. And when you swallow a bolus of food, that food will be carried down the esophagus by muscular action. And there are waves of muscular action that happen. We'll discuss that when we talk about the motility section. And the esophagus ends at the stomach. So the level of the stomach is where the esophagus ends. And so here's a look at the stomach. The esophagus ends at a sphincter. So there is a circular region of smooth muscle that closes off the contents of the stomach from the contents of the esophagus. And this is very important because the stomach produces some pretty acidic gastric juices. And these gastric juices, if they go into the esophagus, it can burn the lining of the esophagus and lead to really really serious inflammation of the lining of it. Major parts of the stomach include the fundus of the stomach. This fundus is just the area that extends beyond where the esophagus connects to the stomach. So anything above that is really referred to as the fundus. The main part of the stomach is the body of the stomach. Right after the body of the stomach, there's a small area where it starts to narrow. This is referred to as the antrum. And then the narrowest part of the stomach is referred to as the pylorus. And this is the end of the stomach that, that starts the small intestine. So right after the pylorus, that's where your small intestine starts. Notice that the stomach is a sort of a J-shaped organ. And the stomach really acts as an intermediate place between eating and the physiologic events of digestion and absorption. And it sort of acts as this area where the partially digested food can hang out while the small intestine is dealing with what came before that. And so it really is a place where, yes, there is digestion. Yes, there's physical digestion because the stomach sort of churns and helps break down the food stuff even more. Yes, there's chemical digestion because it produces enzymes to break down the food. But it also acts as a place where the partially digested food can hang out until the small intestine is ready for it. You don't want too much stuff going in the small intestine because then everything gets overwhelmed. The next part of the digestive tract is the small intestine. Small intestine only referring to the diameter of it. It's longer than the large intestine. It's just a smaller lumen or diameter of the opening. Most digestion actually happens in the small intestine. Most nutrient absorption happens in the small intestine. And there's three major sections. There is the duodenum. That's the first part that extends right from the stomach. There is the jejunum, which is the second part of the small intestine. And there's the ileum, which is the third part of the small intestine. It's very hard to discuss the actual anatomic region where the jejunum starts and the ileum starts, where the jejunum ends and the ileum starts. They sort of bleed into each other. It's very much a gray zone. There are ways to tell whether you're in the jejunum or the ileum. That's more of a really intense anatomical discussion, but just know that it's kind of a gray area with where the jejunum ends and the ileum begins. But most of the digestion happens here. Most of the absorption of major nutrients happens here. The small intestine contains enzymes. We're going to talk about these enzymes. And these enzymes will help break down some sugars. These enzymes will help activate other enzymes to help with digestion of proteins and fats. We're going to talk about all of these. The small intestine is also the place that accepts secretions from two glands of the body. And these two glands that it accepts secretions from are the pancreas and the gallbladder. And these secretions from the pancreas and the gallbladder, so you can kind of see the part of the gallbladder in the back here, this little green structure. And the pancreas is this sort of yellowish structure that sits behind the stomach, and the duodenum kind of wraps around it. That's the pancreas. The small intestine accepts secretions through a series of ducts and openings. So there's a tube that runs through the pancreas. There's a series of tubes that runs from the gallbladder and the liver into the small intestine. And anything that is released from those areas goes right into the small intestine. And there is a smooth muscle sphincter that regulates the flow of the substances from these two areas. And this particular sphincter is called the sphincter of Oddi. So the sphincter of Oddi, when it relaxes, it'll allow secretions from the gallbladder and the pancreas to enter the small intestine. When it's contracted, it won't allow them. This is something we'll talk about in greater depth later on. After the small intestine, digestion is essentially complete, and all digested nutrients are pretty much absorbed by now. Secreted fluids are in part absorbed, and about 1.5 liters of this stuff called chyme passes on to the colon. Chyme is just the name for the partially digested food stuff that comes from the stomach and goes into the small intestine. So all of this stuff that enters the small intestine, passes through it, and enters the colon is called chyme. Large intestine, or the colon, is the last part of the gastrointestinal tract. Large intestine because the luminal diameter is greater than the small intestine. This is where a lot of the water is reabsorbed or absorbed, and where electrolytes like sodium chloride, some potassium are absorbed. And this is the area where wastes are eliminated. And so the two parts of the the last two parts of the digestive system are the rectum, and that's where feces is in, that's where feces sort of ends up before it's eliminated. And when feces enters the rectum, there is the defecation response. And when that defecation response is initiated, the feces passes through the anus, and there is a sphincter that exists called the external anal sphincter that will relax and allow for feces to be eliminated from the body. This external anal sphincter is under voluntary control, which is a rather good thing for social norms. And so that's the end of the tube section of our digestive system. But there's more to it than that. There are some accessory organs that contribute to the functions of the gastrointestinal system. And these accessory organs are the liver, the gallbladder, the pancreas, and the salivary glands. We've already sort of discussed the salivary glands, or the basic functions of them. And we'll talk about the other three in brief. The liver and the gallbladder. The liver is the largest internal organ. It's not the largest organ of the body, as you probably already know. The skin is the largest organ of the body. But if we're talking about internal organ, liver. And the largest internal organ also has a smaller accessory organ called the gallbladder that is connected to it. The liver is on the right side of the body. It sort of covers the upper right portion of the abdominal area. It extends a little bit into the center, the upper center area, and a little tiny bit onto the left upper area of the abdominal area. And then tucked underneath of the liver is the gallbladder. So the liver and the gallbladder kind of work together. The liver has many functions, but when talked about with the gallbladder is an area that stores something called bile. And bile is really a very important substance in breaking down fats and lipids, or not breaking them down, emulsifying them, turning big fat globules into tiny little fat globules that are easier to break down by the enzymes. In order to get bile from the liver into the gallbladder, and from the gallbladder into the small intestine, there are a series of ducts. And these ducts, so bile is generally made in the liver. And so this bile comes from two little ducts, these green ducts. Bile is released from the liver in the right hepatic duct and the left hepatic duct. And these two ducts, so they come together, and anytime in anatomy that a left and a right side come together, they refer to it as common. It's a common word in anatomy. So the left hepatic duct and the right hepatic duct come together to make the common hepatic duct. So this common hepatic duct is where bile is released, and then bile gets stored in the gallbladder. And when it's stored in the gallbladder, it sort of sits there until the gallbladder is ready to release it. And so the first reason for the gallbladder is, number one, to store the bile. But the gallbladder has a secondary function, and that secondary function is to really concentrate that bile. It's able to concentrate that bile up to 10 times, so that that bile works very, very effectively to emulsify fats. If you had bile just going from the liver into the small intestine, that wouldn't work as well to emulsify fats. Yep, you can still do it, and you can still break down fats, but you can't break down fats as efficiently. So people who've had their gallbladder removed, they tend not to be able to handle very rich meals that are high in lipids anymore. So they have to be really careful, because the concentrating ability of the gallbladder when you have your gallbladder removed is gone. So we have the common hepatic duct, and then we have all this bile that's going to be stored in the gallbladder. When the gallbladder releases the bile, it goes down this duct that's attached to the gallbladder, and this is called the cystic duct. And the cystic duct connects with the common hepatic duct to make another duct. I know that there's a lot of names here, but the cystic duct and the common hepatic duct come together to make the duct that carries bile to the small intestine. And it's called the common bile duct. So it takes the hepatic duct, the common hepatic duct bile, and the cystic duct bile. And when those two ducts come together, it's called the common bile duct, or the CBD for short. So the common bile duct, as you can see, it wraps around or behind the stomach and the duodenum, and it enters the first part of the small intestine, which is the duodenum, and there's this small little opening within the small intestine where the bile can pass through. And that opening, it's not always open. There's a small little amount of smooth muscle there that controls whether bile goes through or whether bile is stopped from going through. And that's that sphincter of Oddi that we talked about earlier. We're gonna look at this again later on in the course. So the major functions of the liver, we only talked about bile synthesis really, but it has a huge number of functions. It is involved in glucose metabolism, lipid metabolism, protein metabolism, hormone synthesis, urea production, detoxification. It stores substances like glycogen. It stores various vitamins. It has a lot of functions, and that's in addition to the bile function of the liver. So we're going to go back and talk about the physiologic functions of the gallbladder and the liver when we talk about bile a little bit later on in the GI section. The other accessory organ that we need to talk about is the pancreas. The pancreas really has actually two functions. There's two major functions. The pancreas can actually act as a digestive organ, so where it actually releases digestive proteins or enzymes that will aid in the breakdown of various biomolecules. And when we refer to the part of the pancreas that acts as a digestive organ, we refer to that as the exocrine pancreas. And so anytime you see exocrine pancreas, it's always referring to the function of the pancreas that acts as a digestive organ. But there are also other cells within the pancreas that act to make hormones like insulin, hormones like glucagon. And when we talk about the hormone function of the pancreas, we refer to that part of the pancreas as the endocrine section of the pancreas. Now, there's not a half of the pancreas that makes digestive enzymes and the other half makes hormones. There's no anatomic delineation. The cells that make the digestive organs and the cells that make the digestive enzymes and the cells that make the hormones are scattered throughout the pancreas. You can't separate the two pieces of the pancreas from an anatomic standpoint. And so the exocrine pancreas, or the one that actually makes digestive enzymes, there are parts of it called the lobules, and these lobules are called acini. And all of these cells here, you can see these are the acinar cells, or the acini of the pancreas. And this is of the exocrine pancreas. So the digestive enzymes are going to be produced in these cells, and they're going to be brought into this duct system. And this duct system, it goes into the lumen of this duct and eventually joins up with the duct that runs throughout the entire length of the pancreas. This is called the pancreatic duct, logically enough. And that pancreatic duct, all the juices, all the digestive enzymes go from that pancreatic duct and go into the small intestine. And it's that same opening that allows the bile to go through, allows for the pancreatic juices to go through as well. So those are the acinar cells. Every part of the exocrine pancreas opens to this ductal system. So this acinar lobule opens up to the ductal system. This one would open up to the ductal system. All of them open up to the ductal system and then go into the small intestine. The endocrine pancreas, on the other hand, is a completely separate group of cells. So rather than these acinar cells that open to the ducts, you can see these other yellow conglomerations of cells. This is part of the endocrine pancreas. So there's a collection of these cells here. You can see another collection of these cells here. And if you were to look at more regions of the pancreas that were magnified, you would see these groupings of these endocrine type cells scattered throughout. So again, they can't be separated anatomically. They're just sort of scattered throughout in a relatively random fashion. The difference between that exocrine function that went into the ductal system and the endocrine function, if you remember from the first classes that when I talked about endocrine hormones, when I talked about endocrine hormones, I said that they enter the bloodstream. And so I want you to notice that each one of these collections of endocrine cells, these are called the islet cells. All of these cells collectively are called islet cells. They all surround this little blood vessel. So this would be a capillary. And so any of the hormones that are being released from these cells would enter the capillary and enter the bloodstream. So again, a very different setup. These hormones don't enter this lumen system, they enter the bloodstream. And these digestive enzymes don't enter the bloodstream, they enter the gastrointestinal tract. And eventually the pancreatic duct will join up with the small intestine. So again, two very different parts of the pancreas, two very different structures, and both of the areas of the pancreas have very different functions. So you can see how they're set up differently to allow for those functions to happen. You can imagine what might happen if these cells that make digestive enzymes open to a capillary. If they open to a capillary, you would be putting enzymes in your bloodstream that break down proteins and break down fats and break down carbohydrates. That would be really bad. You'd start breaking down all the cells of your bloodstream and you'd have a problem. You'd have a big problem. So Um, Now that we've sort of talked about the basic features of the GI tract from an anatomical standpoint, we're going to talk about the microscopic anatomy of the GI tract. And microscopic anatomy, and we're really going to talk about the layers of the GI tract, but we're going to focus on the stomach and the small intestine. Majority of the areas within the GI tract have similar layers. The ones of the stomach and the small intestine are, in my opinion, the more important ones to understand. And the four layers that we're going to discuss are things called the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis externa, and the serosa. And this goes from um, if we're in the lumen of the GI tract, if we're in the lumen and we're looking at the cells that line the lumen, that's the mucosa. If you go one step deeper than those cells, you end up in the submucosa. A step deeper from that, you're in the muscularis externa. And then the deepest layer is the serosa. So here's a chunk of the stomach, and it's sort of in cross section so that you can see this would be the lumen of the stomach right here. And then you can see what happens when you go deeper and deeper and deeper. And these are all the layers of the stomach. Similar sort of thing with the small intestine. The lumen, and then the lining of the small intestine. And then as you go deeper, you go through a lot of layers. Right now, we're talking about the mucosa. The mucosa is this first region of the small intestine that's closest to the lumen. So it consists of a single layer of cells. So you can see that the lumen is lined by the single layer of cells. These are called the epithelial cells. This exists in the stomach, it exists in the small intestine, it exists in the esophagus, it exists in the large intestine. These are the epithelial cells. It's a single layer of cells, too, that are just lining the organ. If you go a little bit deeper, you can actually see that there's this yellow region with some blood vessels in it. That's referred to as the lamina propria. So the lamina propria, we're going to talk about all the functions of the lamina propria. And then if you go just deep to that, there's this thin layer, this thin red section. This is a muscular section, and this is the muscularis mucosa. And this is the deepest part of the mucosa that separates the mucosa from the submucosa. So this is the delineating part. If we look at the mucosa from a macroscopic level, if we're just looking at the organ of the stomach and we're just looking at the organ of the small intestine, you're going to notice a couple of things. The stomach has all of these folds. If you were to look on the inside of the lumen of the stomach, it has these folds. These folds are called rugae. And the rugae serve to increase surface area. There's a folded appearance to the small intestine as well. So if you were to take the small intestine and you were to cut it open lengthwise and unfold it, you would see that the lining of the small intestine actually has these ridges to it. And you can see these ridges with the naked eye. You don't need a microscope to see these ridges. And these ridges are called the circular folds, because you can imagine that when you're looking at it from the inside of the small intestine, these circular folds, they're actually around the entire circumference of the small intestine. So they make circular folds. Sometimes they're called plicae, probably just to make your life miserable to have to remember another term for them. They're sometimes referred to as plicae circularis, plicae meaning fold and circularis meaning circular. There's also another modification to the small intestine that are villi. You can't really see the villi with the naked eye, but there are all of these little tiny folds all along the surface of the small intestine. And these villi also help both of these structures, the plicae, the villi, and the rugae in the stomach. They all serve to increase surface area. increased surface area is fundamental to making sure that we can maximize, number one, the digestive surface of these organs and maximize the absorptive surface as well. The more surface area you have, the more efficient the process of digestion is. So additionally, there are, within the mucosa, in the stomach, there are things called gastric glands that are part of the mucosa. And a gastric gland is really just one of these deep, I don't want to call them crypts, but these deep valleys. These are the gastric glands. And they go deep within the mucosal surface. And I didn't want to call them crypts because they're called crypts in the small intestine. There's these deep valleys that are called crypts. And these further increase the surface area. The deeper the folds are, the more surface area you get, and the more compact your structure can be, while at the same time maintaining a high level of surface area for digestive processes. So we'll talk a bit about the epithelium. The epithelium, or that single layer of cells of the mucosa, it has a secretory function. So a lot of these cells will secrete things. As you get deeper into these gastric glands, there are stem cells. And these stem cells divide. And as they divide, they push the older cells up. They push it up. And the older cells, as they move up the gastric gland, they mature. And there are many types of cells within the gastric gland. And as they mature, they turn into different types of cells that secrete different substances. By the end of this GI section, you're going to know the function of every single type of cell within the gastric glands. In this epithelium, there are also mucus secreting cells that you can imagine. The stomach is very low pH, very acidic. The acidic substances, you can imagine, you wouldn't want it to come into contact with the cells of the stomach. So these mucus secreting cells secrete a layer of mucus to protect the cells of the stomach from the acid. So your entire stomach is lined with mucus, and the acid that is within it doesn't start breaking down the cells that line it. There are also some transporting cells within the epithelium. And whether you're talking about the stomach or the intestine, these types of cells are very common to both. There are nutrient transporting cells, and in both the stomach and the small intestine. These nutrient transporting cells, or absorptive, that have an absorptive function, they are more common within the small intestine, because that's really the major place that absorption is happening. The stem cells, as I mentioned, they're rapidly dividing in the gastric glands and in the crypts of the small intestine. And then, as I mentioned, as the new cells are formed, they push the older ones toward the lumen. And as they push the older ones toward the lumen, those cells change to have a very specific function. So they all start out as the same cell, but depending on what factors they're exposed to, they'll turn into maybe a cell that produces acid. Maybe it'll turn into a cell that produces protein digestive enzymes. Maybe it'll turn into a cell that produces mucus. But all of those cells come from a common stem cell at the base of the crypts and of the base of the gastric glands. There is the subepithelium, and that's really just under the epithelium. So if you go deep to this one layer of cells, this is the area called the lamina propria. The yellow shaded area is really just connective tissue that helps increase the stability of the tissue and the integrity of the tissue. You can see the red vessels that are passing through the lamina propria. Those are the arteries. The blue vessels that are passing through the area, those are the veins. And there are some, and I guess you can't really see them in here, but there are some yellow vessels, and those yellow vessels are nerves. So there's some small nerves within the lamina propria as well. One thing to make note of is this green circular structure within the lamina propria. And if you looked at the lamina propria, you'd see these green structures scattered throughout. These are called Peyer's patches. And a Peyer's patch is just that collection of lymphoid tissue that we talked about earlier, that gut-associated lymphoid tissue. And that is the major player in helping the gut maintain a high level of immunity. So these Peyer's patches within the lamina propria make up a major part of the GALT system, or that gut-associated lymphoid tissue for the immune function. Going a little bit deeper, you have the very thin layer of muscle called the muscularis mucosa. It's the muscle layer associated with the mucosa, so muscularis mucosa. There's really no better name for it. It is also the delineating factor between the mucosa and the submucosa. So the muscularis mucosa, yes, it separates, but it also actually plays a role when it contracts. It helps the little tiny folds of the small intestine, those villi that we talked about a couple slides ago. Let's see, where are they? Those villi. It helps those villi move back and forth to really increase the amount of the chance that those villi will actually come into contact with the right molecules and allow for an increased digestive surface and that increased absorptive surface. So now we'll go a little bit deeper. The submucosa is just deep to the mucosa. And so underneath of that muscularis mucosa is the submucosa. It again contains a lot of connective tissue, You'll notice that the blood vessels that it contains are a lot bigger than the blood vessels that were in the mucosa. So these larger blood vessels. There is also within the submucosa, there are these green vessels as well. Anytime you see green in a diagram, it's either referring to the gallbladder and bile, or it's referring to lymphatic vessels, which help reabsorb extra fluid and put it back in the bloodstream. And that's what these lymphatic tissues are. That green area are these large lymphatic vessels. I want you to make note of the submucosa in the small intestine. So there's that muscularis mucosa, just like the stomach, those large vessels. I want you to notice that there's some nerves within there as well. And these nerves are part of what is referred to as the submucosal plexus. So this submucosal plexus, we'll talk about this. This is actually a part of a branch of the nervous system called the enteric nervous system. Enteric just referring to intestinal and gastrointestinal. Anytime you see that, if somebody has gastroenteritis, it's an inflammation of their stomach and intestine. So enteric just refers to as the gastrointestinal system. It's actually a branch of the nervous system that you may not have heard of before. And it functions to give nerve supply to the epithelium and to the muscularis mucosa muscle. So it actually, any nerve that you have, it has some function in giving off little tiny branches to specific regions of the body. So this particular nerve plexus gives off branches to that submucosal plexus so that it can work to actually contract. And it gives off little branches to the epithelium as well. So that those cells can give signals to release its substances, whatever it happens to be releasing. Anytime you hear the word plexus, all that refers to is that it's a network of nerves. If you were to separate these nerves, or this particular plexus of nerves from the muscularis mucosa, it would look like a meshwork of small little branches of nerves all creating a mesh. That's what the word plexus means. So the enteric nervous system, I actually want to make a bit of a small little presentation on my whiteboard associated screen, whereby I can describe for you what I mean by the enteric nervous system and what that entails. Just give me one moment, because it'll just take a second for me to actually connect this whiteboard. I wasn't planning on using it, but we are going to just share my whiteboard screen. Hopefully it'll work. Hopefully this will work. And let's see, do we have success? Almost. I have success. Okay. So now I'm going to share my whiteboard screen with you. And so now you should be able to see the whiteboard screen. So when I talk about the enteric nervous system, you should really have a bit of an understanding of what the major parts of the nervous system are. So the nervous system can be separated into two major parts. There's the central nervous system, that's the part of the nervous system where any of the nerves are from either the brain or the spinal cord. Then there is the peripheral nervous system. This peripheral nervous system can be broken up into two regions. The regions of the peripheral nervous system are the somatic nervous system and these are the nerves that control your skeletal muscles for the most part, as well as sensation to your skin. So controlling the skeletal muscles, some of the sensation to skin. And so basically the parts of your body that are sort of like the skeletal muscles are under voluntary control. That's part of the somatic nervous system. And then there's the autonomic nervous system. Which you may know there's two, what most people usually think about are two major branches of the autonomic nervous system. So people often think about the sympathetic nervous system, or the SNS. So that's sympathetic. Or the parasympathetic nervous system, or the PNS. So that is parasympathetic. If you have learned about these before, you may recognize the terms. The sympathetic nervous system so these are under involuntary control. So these two arms of the nervous system happen automatically in the body, hence the name autonomic. The sympathetic nervous system controls what is referred to as the fight or flight response. That fight or flight response is that response with adrenaline and noradrenaline, or epinephrine, norepinephrine. And the parasympathetic response is sometimes referred to as the rest and digest system. So when you're not being chased by a shark or by a grizzly bear, you're in your parasympathetic response. That's what most people um, think of when they think of the autonomic nervous system. Well, there's a third arm of this autonomic nervous system. And this third arm of the autonomic nervous system is the enteric nervous system. And this enteric nervous system controls GI function. Interestingly enough, the enteric nervous system can actually work on its own, and it doesn't actually need any external input whatsoever. That being said, there is some external input from the other arms of the autonomic nervous system. It actually gets quite complicated, but all this was really trying to do is to give you the breakdown of the nervous system and let you know that the autonomic nervous system doesn't only contain two arms, it contains three different regions: parasympathetic, sympathetic, and enteric. So that's what I'm talking about when I mentioned the enteric nervous system. So now I'll go back to the slides. And we will go back to presentation mode. Okay. It's frequently, as I mentioned, frequently controlled by the autonomic nervous system, but it can control itself. It doesn't need any external input whatsoever. And so, as you can see here, there is a sympathetic arm in red, there's a parasympathetic arm in green, and there's this sort of autonomic arm in black. But you can see that there's input from all of them. It's a very complicated input. And these would be the cells of the gastrointestinal tract that all of these little branches and nerve fibers are going to allow for function to happen. So if we go a little bit deeper than within the submucosa, there is another region called the muscularis externa. So don't get confused here. We have some common names. We have the muscularis mucosa that separates the mucosa and the submucosa. And then within the submucosa, there's another layer of muscle. And actually, there's multiple layers of muscle. And this is referred to as the muscularis externa. Notice that in the stomach, there's actually a muscle here. There's a layer of muscle here. There's a layer of muscle here. And there's a layer of muscle even deeper than that. The stomach has three layers of the muscularis externa. It has a layer that is referred to as the circular layer. So if you can imagine, there would be a layer of muscle that would wrap around the entire lumen. And when that muscle contracts, it would actually decrease the luminal diameter of the stomach. There's also the longitudinal layer that runs the entire length of the stomach. And when those muscle fibers contract, you can imagine that the actual length of the stomach would shorten. And so those processes sort of happening together would help for the decreased lumen, decreased length, back and forth and back and forth. And that allows for the churning function of the stomach. So it kind of churns the food. The stomach also has this oblique layer as well. And oblique just stands for the fact that it's going to sort of go around the stomach, but not in circles. It sort of goes around in these sort of ellipse patterns. And at an angle to the circular muscles. They also have a function in churning and with physical digestion of food. If we look at the muscularis externa of the small intestine, there's only two layers. There's that circular layer and the longitudinal layer. Again, the circular layer is really just wrapping around the whole lumen. And when those muscle fibers shorten, you shorten the luminal diameter of the small intestine. And that longitudinal layer, when those muscle fibers contract, you actually decrease the length of the small intestine. So that back and forth action allows for mixing of substances together. The small intestine does not contain that oblique layer of muscle. Notice that there is another, so here's the nerve meshwork that we talked about already. the submucosal plexus. There's another plexus actually. So there's another group of nerves that is deep to that, and it's actually between the circular layer and the longitudinal layer of muscle. And it's called the myenteric plexus. And so the myenteric plexus gives control and gives nerve input to the muscles of the muscularis externa. So you can imagine that there would be little fibers that are going to the circular muscles and little fibers that are going to the longitudinal muscles. And when we talk about a nerve supplying something, the term that we use is innervate. It innervates those muscles, innervates. The last layer of the GI organs, specifically the stomach and the small intestine, is the serosa. So deep to that longitudinal muscle in both, there's another small layer that contains a bunch of connective tissue, and it contains some blood vessels, arteries and nerves, and it really just allows for the integrity of the organ to be maintained. This, if you were to actually look at an organ in an anatomy lab, you were to look at the small intestine, what you're looking at is the serosa. It's that covering of the small intestine and the stomach. I'm going to go back a little bit to show you right here. So what you're looking at here, this is the covering of the stomach. This is the covering of the small intestine. What you're looking at is the serosa. So you can see that if you go really deep in the layers of the folds, it's actually easier to see in the small intestine. You go through the mucosa, the submucosa, and the serosa. And you can see that that serosa is actually just the covering of the organ itself. So we'll stop there. I know that's a lot of information. You may want to review this a couple of times to really get the terminology down pat and really get the anatomical features down pat. Going through it a couple of times will really help solidify your understanding of it. We'll continue next presentation by talking about some of the processes that need to be coordinated within the GI tract in order to maintain the functions. So the first one we're going to talk about is motility. How do these muscles actually work and how do they move? So we're going to talk about different processes of movement within the GI tract, and then the specific physiologic mechanism for how the muscle contracts. This is going to be different than muscle contraction that you've probably learned about in the past. You've probably learned about the muscle contraction of skeletal muscle. It's a different process, similar but different.